Sarah, Mark, Emily, and David were four best friends who had known each other since childhood. They had always been inseparable, spending every moment together, sharing their secrets, hopes, and fears. They had grown up together in a small town where nothing ever happened, but that all changed one fateful day when they stumbled upon an old, dusty bed at a garage sale. The bed was beautiful, with intricately carved head and footboards, and a soft, plush mattress. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before, and they knew they had to have it. They pooled their money together and bought it on the spot, lugging it back to Sarah's house where they set it up in her spare bedroom. That night, they took turns sleeping on the bed, each one excited to have a turn on their new purchase. But as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. They all had nightmares, vivid and terrifying, filled with images of grotesque creatures and twisted landscapes. When they woke up, they found themselves covered in sweat, shaking with fear. At first, they thought it was just a fluke, that maybe they had eaten something bad or were stressed out from school. But as the days went on, the nightmares continued, becoming more vivid and more terrifying with each passing night. One night, David woke up screaming, his eyes wide with terror. He claimed that he had seen a ghostly figure standing at the foot of the bed, its eyes glowing with a sinister red light. The others dismissed it as a dream, but deep down, they were all starting to feel a sense of unease about the bed. They tried everything to get rid of the nightmares. They burned sage, they sprinkled holy water, they even went to a psychic who claimed to be able to remove curses, but nothing worked. The nightmares persisted, driving them to the brink of madness. As the weeks turned into months, the friends began to notice other strange things happening in the house. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close by themselves, and strange noises could be heard coming from the walls. They tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The bed had become a cursed object, haunting them with its malevolent magic. The once close friends began to drift apart, each consumed by their own fear and paranoia. They stopped sleeping over at Sarah's house, too afraid to face the horrors that awaited them on the cursed bed. Eventually, they stopped talking altogether, too afraid to admit what they had experienced. But the bed was not done with them yet. It had claimed them as its own, and it would not rest until it had driven them all to the brink of madness. Sarah was the first to return to the cursed bed. She couldn't stay away, drawn to it by an inexplicable force that she couldn't resist. She convinced herself that the nightmares were just a figment of her imagination, that she was stronger than the bed's malevolent magic. She climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, and closed her eyes. At first, it seemed like nothing was happening. She was lying there, alone in the dark, with nothing but the sound of her own breathing to keep her company. But then she felt it, a tingling sensation that started at the tips of her toes and slowly worked its way up her body. It was like nothing she had ever experienced before, a strange combination of pleasure and pain that left her gasping for breath. As the sensation intensified, she began to see things, strange and terrifying things that she couldn't explain. She saw images of demons and monsters, of people being tortured and mutilated. It was like she was in a trance, unable to look away from the horrors that were unfolding before her eyes. When she finally snapped out of it, she was covered in sweat, her heart racing in her chest. She sat up in bed, looking around the room, but everything seemed normal. There were no demons or monsters lurking in the shadows, no signs of the horrors she had just witnessed. She got out of bed and walked over to the window, looking out at the street below. It was quiet, with only a few cars passing by. She felt a sense of relief wash over her, as if she had just woken up from a nightmare. But then she heard it, a soft whisper coming from behind her. She turned around, but there was no one there. She was alone in the room, with nothing but the sound of her own breathing to keep her company. She climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, and closed her eyes. She tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, that the whispers were just a product of her overactive imagination. But deep down, She knew the truth. The bed had claimed her, just like it had claimed her friends, and there was nothing she could do to escape its grasp. Emily had been avoiding the cursed bed for weeks, too afraid to face the horrors that awaited her. But one night, she found herself standing in front of Sarah's house, unable to resist the pull of the bed's malevolent magic. She climbed the stairs to the spare bedroom, her heart racing in her chest. She knew she shouldn't be there, knew that the bed was cursed, but she couldn't help herself. She was drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. She climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, and closed her eyes. At first, it seemed like nothing was happening. She was lying there, alone in the dark, with nothing but the sound of her own breathing to keep her company. But then she felt it, a cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. It brushed against her face, sending a chill down her spine. She sat up in bed, looking around the room, but there was no one there. She lay back down, closing her eyes again, but the cold breeze persisted. She felt like she was being watched, like there was something in the room with her that she couldn't see. And then she heard it, a soft whisper that seemed to come from right next to her ear. It was a voice she didn't recognize, low and menacing. It whispered her name over and over again, until she thought she was going to go insane. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, but the whispers persisted. They grew louder and more insistent, until she couldn't take it anymore. She sat up in bed, looking around the room, but there was still no one there. She was alone in the room, with nothing but the cold breeze and the whispers to keep her company. She climbed out of bed, her heart racing in her chest, and walked over to the window. She looked out at the street below, trying to calm herself down, but the whispers persisted. They grew louder and more insistent, until she felt like she was going to go insane. And then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was like nothing she had ever seen before, a shapeless mass that seemed to be made out of pure darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but she could feel its malevolent presence. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. She was frozen, unable to move, unable to look away from the shadowy figure. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Emily was left alone in the room, shaking with fear. She knew the bed was cursed, knew that she should never have come back, but it was too late. The bed had claimed her, just like it had claimed her friends, and there was nothing she could do to escape its grasp. David had always been the skeptic of the group, dismissing the idea of a cursed bed as pure nonsense. He had never experienced anything supernatural in his life, and had always believed that everything could be explained by science. But that all changed when he climbed into the cursed bed. At first, he felt nothing out of the ordinary. He lay down, closed his eyes, and waited for something to happen. But nothing did. It was just a regular bed, in a regular room, with nothing to indicate that it was cursed. But then he began to hear it, a faint scratching sound that seemed to be coming from beneath the bed. It was like someone was dragging their nails along the wooden slats, over and over again. He sat up in bed, listening intently. The scratching continued, growing louder and more insistent. He climbed out of bed, looking beneath it, but there was nothing there. The scratching continued, getting louder and more frenzied, until he thought he was going to go insane. And then he saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring back at him from the darkness beneath the bed. They were red and unblinking, like the eyes of some malevolent creature. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. He was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to look away from the eyes. And then they were gone. The scratching stopped, and the room was silent once again. David climbed back into bed, his heart racing in his chest. He knew he had seen something, knew that there was something in the room with him, but he couldn't explain it. The scratching started again, fainter this time, but still there. It was like whatever was beneath the bed was trying to claw its way out. He lay there, listening to the scratching, growing more and more frenzied by the minute. He could feel himself starting to lose his grip on reality, the scratching driving him to the brink of madness. and then it stopped. The room was silent once again, and David was left alone in the dark. But he knew it wasn't over, knew that there was something in the room with him that he couldn't see. He climbed out of bed, searching the room for any sign of the creature. But there was nothing there, just an empty room with a cursed bed in the center. David knew that he had to leave, had to get out of the house before the bed drove him completely insane. But he also knew that he couldn't leave his friends behind. They were trapped in the house, just like he was, and he had to find a way to save them. He lay down in the cursed bed once again, determined to figure out what was happening, determined to put an end to the curse once and for all. But he knew that he was playing a dangerous game, and that there was no telling what horrors awaited him. Rebecca was always the quiet one of the group, content to listen to her friends' conversations rather than participating in them herself. But as the night wore on, and the curse of the bed grew stronger, she began to feel a strange energy coursing through her body, as if she was awakening from a long sleep. She sat up in bed, her heart racing as she looked around the room. Everything seemed to be shifting and changing, the walls twisting and turning as if alive. Suddenly, a voice spoke to her from the darkness, a soft whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "Rebecca," the voice said, "do you know what this bed is?" She shook her head, too afraid to speak. "It's a gateway," the voice continued, "a gateway to another world, a world of darkness and terror, and if you don't stop it, it will consume us all." Rebecca felt a surge of energy flow through her, a sense of purpose that she had never felt before. She knew that she had to find a way to stop the curse, had to find a way to save her friends. She climbed out of bed and began to search the room, looking for any clue that could help her break the curse. And then she saw it, a small symbol etched into the wall above the bed. It was a symbol of protection, one that her grandmother had taught her when she was a child. It was said to ward off evil spirits and protect against curses and hexes. Rebecca knew what she had to do. She climbed back into the cursed bed and reached up, tracing the symbol with her fingers. As she did, she felt a surge of energy flow through her, a sense of power that she had never experienced before. The room began to shake, the curse of the bed growing stronger by the second. But Rebecca held firm, her fingers tracing the symbol over and over again, until the room was filled with a blinding light. And then it was over. The room was still, and the curse of the bed was broken. Rebecca climbed out of bed, her body shaking with exhaustion, but she knew that she had done what she needed to do, had saved her friends from a fate worse than death. As she looked around the room, she realized that everything had changed. The walls were no longer twisting and turning, and the air was filled with a sense of peace that she had never experienced before. She knew that the curse was gone, but she also knew that she would never forget the horrors she had witnessed that night. The cursed bed had brought them to the brink of madness, but she had found a way to save them. And as she left the room, she knew that she had unlocked a power within herself that she had never known existed. A power that could protect her against any curse, any hex, any darkness that threatened to consume her. As Rebecca left the cursed room, she could feel a sense of relief washing over her. The horrors of the cursed bed were behind them, and she and her friends could finally leave the abandoned house. But as they made their way down the stairs, they realized that something was wrong. The staircase seemed to go on forever, and no matter how far they descended, they never seemed to get any closer to the ground floor. Panic began to set in, and Rebecca's friends started to cry out for help. But Rebecca remained calm, her mind focused on finding a way out of the nightmare. She remembered the symbol of protection that she had traced on the wall of the cursed room, and she began to draw it in the air with her finger. As she did, a faint glow emanated from her hand, and the staircase began to shift and change. The walls of the staircase began to peel away, revealing a dark and twisted landscape beyond. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and strange, monstrous shapes loomed in the distance. Rebecca and her friends stepped cautiously into the dark landscape, each step taking them deeper into the nightmare. The ground was soft and squishy beneath their feet, and they could hear strange whispering voices in the distance. As they pressed on, they began to see flickering lights in the distance. They followed the lights, drawn by an unknown force, until they found themselves standing before a massive twisted tree. The tree was covered in gnarled branches and thorns, and at its base there was a dark, gaping hole that seemed to lead straight down into the heart of the earth. Rebecca knew that they had to keep moving, that they couldn't stop until they found a way out of the nightmare. She reached out to touch the tree, and as she did, she felt a sudden surge of power flow through her. She closed her eyes and focused on the symbol of protection once more, tracing it on the trunk of the twisted tree. As she did, the tree began to writhe and twist, its branches lashing out in all directions. But Rebecca held firm, and soon the tree began to wither and die. The hole at the base of the tree closed up, and a bright light filled the area around them. When the light faded, they found themselves standing in the abandoned house once again, surrounded by the wreckage of the cursed bed. Rebecca and her friends looked at each other, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. They knew that they had escaped from the nightmare, but they also knew that they would never be the same again. As they made their way out of the abandoned house, they could feel a sense of relief washing over them. They had escaped from the nightmare, but they knew that they would never forget the horrors they had witnessed. Rebecca knew that she had unlocked a power within herself, a power that could protect her against any curse, any darkness that threatened to consume her. And as she left the abandoned house behind, she knew that she would always be ready to face the next nightmare, no matter how terrifying it might be.